Yes, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome you all. Thank you very much for attending the Chicago Chinese American Youth Leadership Forum. I'm Xinwu Wang, Chairman of the Board of Chinese American Association at Greater Chicago. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Jen Chen, the President of the Chinese American Association at Greater Chicago, to give a welcome remark.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Good afternoon. This is Jen Zhen. On behalf of Chinese American Association Greater Chicago, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Youth Leadership Forum. There's a prevalent notion that Chinese American students are not disadvantaged. The truth is many of them come from first-generation immigrant family. Therefore, many have to struggle daily to overcome language, culture barriers in order to excel in school and become active members of their community. 2021 is the first year we host the Youth Leadership Forum. We hope this forum will start a discussion to help Chinese American youth to rise above the obstacles before them and fulfill their potential by promoting education, instilling self-confidence, and developing leadership skills so they can become valuable contributors to the society. Today is also the official kickoff for the 10th Chicago Chinese Youth. This program recognizes and encourages high school students who have demonstrated leadership skills and also made positive impact on the quality of life of others. We're very honored to have Dr. Chen with us today, who is not only an expert on cross-culture psychology, but also very passionate about student emotional awareness for immigrant families. Today, we also have 3 outstanding panelists who will tell their interesting stories and help us not only understand what they have achieved, but most importantly, who they are. On behalf of CAGC, we appreciate IIT for co-sponsoring this program. We're looking forward to this very important and meaningful dialogue. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, President. We are very honored to have Dr. Peter Kilpatrick, the Provost of Illinois Institute of Technology, to be with us today.
Thank you very
much. Welcome him to give us a speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, and Illinois Tech is very proud to co-host this event, the first Chinese Youth Leadership Forum presented by the Chinese American Association of Greater Chicago and co-hosted by Illinois Tech. And I want to congratulate Dr. Justin Chen, Jeremy, Kathy, and Zach, and I look forward to their remarks. Illinois Tech prides itself on being a home for first-generation students from the Greater Chicago area, and we welcome Chinese American students along with many other ethnicities and first-generation students who join us at Illinois Tech to become tech professionals. We're excited to be here. I look forward to the remarks, and I would say that leadership is a very important value at our university. And so I'm interested to hear what our young leaders have to say today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kilpatrick. I think the spotlight of today's forum should be given to Dr. Justin Chen. He is an associate professor at Harvard Medical School and the medical doctor of Massachusetts General Hospital. He's also the director of medical student education in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Today, he will first present a speech. Later, he is going to work as the moderator of discussion panel for the forum. Dr. Chen, please take the podium.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, great. So it's my great honor and pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of the work that you all are doing to kind of bring the community together. And as you can see in my title, I think both to celebrate the successes, these are really tremendous successes that we're going to hear about from our 3 award winners today, but also to think a little bit more broadly about what the definition of success is, both for our students as well as for ourselves. So with that, I'll get started with the talk. So in terms of measures, I am the executive director and co-founder of the Massachusetts General Hospital Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness. This is a group we started in 2014 that I'll tell you more about. It's a nonprofit volunteer group, so I do not get paid for this work and any other interest to disclose. But always, even though I don't have many financial conflicts, I always have personal conflicts to disclose. So I should tell you that I am myself the child of Taiwanese immigrants, consider myself second generation. I am a cross-cultural clinician, educator, and researcher, as you heard in the beginning. So that means I see patients, and I do a mix of medication management and also psychotherapy. And I really enjoy working with Asian Americans as well as international students. So some of the stories I'm going to tell you are from the people that I've worked with and spoken with. And I myself have experienced many of the challenges and struggles and triumphs that I will be sharing with you today. So these are some photos from my own childhood. My parents are not here today with us in the audience. They're still alive, but I think they would not hesitate to call themselves tiger parents. They were very eager to see us succeed. And that's part of why they moved to this country. So I just hope that everyone in the audience can think about these three questions, both during my presentation, as well as during the awardees' comments, and then during the discussion. Maybe this can fuel some of our Q&A. So where are areas that you might have conflict with your own child, or if you are the younger generation with your parents? How do you define success for yourself or your child or parent? And how do you think your child or parent would define success? So some of you are aware of the book written by Amy Chua called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. And in it, she wrote that all decent parents want to do what's best for their children. The Chinese just have a totally different idea of how to do that. And believe what you will about this book, but I do think it highlights some very important and interesting cross-cultural challenges that I often see among my students. So what is success in an American context? Well, I think it's actually pretty diverse. And if you look at the faces on this screen, there's a lot of different success stories here. Some are, there's a number of tech entrepreneurs, but there's also a talk show host. You could be a musician, a famous writer like Amy Tan, a basketball player, an Asian American basketball player like Jeremy Lin. The gentleman down here on the right is Mike Resendez, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting at the Boston Globe, featured in the movie Spotlight, or Beyonce, a famous singer. So there's a lot of different ways that success looks. And this is obviously a stereotype and hopefully funny, tongue-in-cheek, but sometimes it feels like for Asian Americans or Chinese Americans, the definition of success can feel very narrow. And so you take this young baby here, and he starts to learn to play the piano and then wins the Intel science competition, goes to an Ivy League university and becomes a doctor. Now, obviously, that is not what every one of you wants for your kids. I get that. And it's not even necessarily what my parents wanted for me, but I do think that there's something familiar about this for many people, and they laugh when they see it. It's like, okay, yeah, that's kind of us. And so I actually think that Amy Chua was right, that all decent parents want very similar things for their kids, right? And that might be summarized by this list here in the middle. We want kids to become educated. We want them to be safe and secure. We want them to have a relationship and to have a family. We want them to be healthy and happy, and we want them to have money. We want them to be stable. So I think it's really not a difference in what we want, but actually the emphasis. And again, these are stereotypes. Take it with a grain of salt. But classically in Western cultures, there's a little more emphasis on things like becoming very independent, following and pursuing your own dreams, making a difference in the world. And perhaps in some more traditional Asian contexts, it's more about stability, more about listening, obedience, filial piety to your parents. And then the third one, maybe impressiveness or face. You want to do things that others will be able to see as well. And so what I've seen in my practice, and the reason I titled my talk, is that I think it's great to push kids. I actually think kids need pushing, right? They're not automatically on their own going to know exactly what they want to do. And this is Angela Duckworth, a psychologist's concept of grit. You may have read about that or read her book even, that, people who succeed have grit. They tend to stick with things even if they don't do well right at the beginning. And that's something I think Chinese families do a very good job of instilling in their kids. The problem that I see is if grit or working hard alone alone is the only thing that we can understand success by. Essentially, I have students who come in and say, the reason I'm not doing well is because I'm lazy. I didn't work hard enough. And sometimes that's true, but often it's not. Often it's a mismatch in their abilities or really their interests. And so what I begin to see is really distorted thinking, what we in psychology and mental health call cognitive distortions or unhelpful thinking styles. We all have these, by the way. Sometimes you may catch yourself saying, it's always or never, kind of this black and white thinking. Well, one thing we often see in Asian students, young Asian students, is a lot of anxiety and perfectionism. They feel like it has to be 100% or else it's a failure. And this has actually been studied. This is an old study now, 13 years old, where Asian American students with perfectionistic thinking were more vulnerable to depression. And it has made me wonder, where does this perfectionistic thinking come from? Does it come from the students? Does it come from the parents? Sometimes it's from the parents, right? Like if it's not, pick your choice of award or title or university. If you don't get into that, then it's garbage. I don't think most parents speak that way, but I do think there is a potential for that. And it also sometimes comes from the students themselves. So I've also seen patients where they'll tell me, my parents never pushed me, but I feel like I have to. And some of that comes from the model minority stereotypes that our kids are exposed to, and also just peer pressure, things that they hear from their peers. You're Asian, you're supposed to be good at math. There's this idea of the Asian fail. I don't know if you've heard of that. An Asian fail is like an A-. For everyone else, it's an F, of course. So I'm going to give you a case from my own practice. This was a striking case. This is a young woman originally from Asia, but who had attended international school in Asia and then came to Boston to an elite university. So when I saw her, she was a senior. She was 21 years old. She had done really well in high school. She was at the top of her class. She had, over a 4.0 GPA, all the rest of it. During college, though, she got lost. She completely got lost. She couldn't figure out what major she wanted. She didn't know which career path to pursue. I mentioned she was an international student. She spoke English fluently because she went to an international school in the country she came from. But she was now for the first time really far away from her parents. And so she was on her own. And by the time I met her as a senior, she was really just living in regret. She was living in the past. She was constantly disappointed in her choices and her decisions. She felt she had wasted her entire 4 years at this university. She felt her 3.5 GPA was only mediocre and she would never get a good job. She was in this sort of cohort of students who all felt like consulting was the best thing you could do, consulting and investment banking. And so that was what everyone in her peers were pursuing. And so she spent all this time on these websites reading about what it takes to get into these jobs and feeling like she would never get it. And I was very concerned because when we met in therapy, she would say life was easier when there were just these hoops you had to jump through. And she had a lot of suicidal thinking. So that was really alarming. This is someone who actually, by most standards, people would be very proud to have this daughter. And yet she really just felt like a total failure and with no direction. And so that's sort of the point that I'm trying to make. Success, yes, of course we want this for our kids, but at what cost? And so one thing that we are more and more aware of in the research is that suicide is a major problem for all young people. It's one of the leading causes of death for all young adults in the college age or transitional age. But Asian American college students are actually more likely to have suicidal thoughts and to attempt suicide than white students. And we've actually also reconfirmed this in a recent study that I think we published a couple of years ago based on the National College Health Assessment. Asian American students were far more likely to think about and attempt suicide than white students, even though they were much less likely to be diagnosed with any mental health condition. They had half the rate of depression or anxiety diagnoses. By the way, I will be happy to share my slides with everyone at the end in a PDF. I'll share that with Jan. And so feel free, I'll put all the references in case you'd like to look any of this up. And shockingly, Asian American women in this age group have the second highest rate of completed suicide of any race or ethnicity. So this is a very vulnerable group. And I just wanted to highlight here on the right, it's a nice photo of one of our colleagues in Boston, Chris Hom. She's all the way on the far right of this photo. She's a social work professor at Boston University who's done a lot of great qualitative research looking at the mental health of young Asian American women. So we need to be aware of this because I think a lot of times in our community, we see the shiny, great examples of successes, and we don't necessarily see some of the costs. And we do know that our model minority, quote unquote, youth are in crisis. There's more and more attention being paid to the mental health of young Asian Americans. And I just highlighted here this Washington Post article about Jeremy Lin, who you all know. We're all very proud of him, Harvard student who went on to the NBA. But he's been a very vocal spokesperson about his own, like being very candid about his own struggles. Interestingly, we were on a panel with him at one point in New York, and he said, when he would wake up in a cold sweat, it wasn't because of his basketball pressures. It was actually, he woke up thinking he didn't study for a test. So he grew up with a lot of that type of pressure. Okay, so let's move on here. And again, I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm obviously talking from this angle. But mental health is something that I don't think we need to talk about enough. And I'm hoping that this conversation will start a little bit of interest among you all to think about what is the mental health of my student, in addition to how successful are they. So Asian Americans actually turn out to be much less likely than whites or the general population to seek mental health treatment, about 2 to 3 times less likely in almost every study that's done. And when they do seek help, they find they're more likely to rate the help received as unhelpful. And that was mirrored in my own experiences. So during residency at Mass General Hospital and McLean Hospital in Boston, I was very fortunate. I was very interested in culture. And so I wanted to work with the Chinese community. So I worked at South Cove Community Health Center in Boston's Chinatown. Using my mediocre Chinese, I was able to do enough to do basic medication management visits. And, so I was sitting there working with these Chinese immigrant population, little lower education status, a lot of restaurant work, 4th grade average education. And so we were thinking about, can we get them, can I refer them to psychotherapy? But I feel like the message I got back from these patients was, why would I tell my private matters to a stranger? Don't air your dirty laundry in public. That's actually also what my aunt in Taiwan told me. She's a physician there, but she said when she found out I was going to psychiatry, she said, that's so weird. Why would anyone tell anyone their problems? So that was really not an option. And then the next thing that we have is medications, for depression or anxiety. They can be very effective. I try to use them very sparingly. I don't like to prescribe, but I will do it if I think it'll help. But what we heard again and again from patients was, we don't want to take medicine for mental health. First of all, we don't think this is an illness. And second of all, these have too many side effects. They might be addictive. We don't want that. So that was out. And then lastly, we have group therapy, but you can imagine, you can just forget about that. I mean, sitting around with a group of people, your peers, and talking about your problems, especially if you're kind of shamed or hiding it, that's really not an option either. So that was what I had experienced in my own clinical training. And here's another case from my practice. So this was another very high achieving young woman. She was just graduating high school and she was about to start at a local elite university in Boston. She actually grew up in Boston as well. She was a very perfectionistic person. Her parents were both scientists, so they were all perfectionists. And she had actually started to have anxiety and depression as a junior in high school, probably even earlier, but that's what she told me. And she was thinking about suicide. But she and her parents all said, we're all scientists. We don't believe in mental illness. We don't think, there's no brain change that we can see on an MRI. There's no lab test for depression, so we don't think it's true. And so they didn't seek really any help until the summer before she was going to start college. And it was very interesting when she saw me, her anxiety was so great that she really couldn't do anything. She was supposed to be submitting a writing sample to be placed in an English class. She couldn't do that. She couldn't even do the things that used to make her happy. So she liked to relieve stress by buying things online. And at this point in time, she was so anxious that she wasn't even able to check her email about these purchases. And there were some, payment issues and things like that were in the emails that she had to manage and deal with. But because she was so anxious, she would actually just leave that email address behind and create a new email address. So that's what she was doing when I met her. She was just creating new email addresses and trying to stay afloat. And she had this black and white thinking that I described, where she said, I don't think I can start school this way, but if I don't, I feel like I'm going to work at Burger King. That was literally the 2 options that she felt she had. This case I've abbreviated, but actually, she didn't end up hospitalized right away. She started her freshman year. She didn't do well. And then finally, she went to the University Health Services for a physical complaint. Actually, she went for asthma exacerbation. And at that point, she revealed her suicidal thoughts and she went to the hospital. So that is a real shame to me. And I think I'm hopeful that some of you all may start to think about, maybe we could think about this earlier and prevent it. So at this point, I'm going to share a brief video that we like to utilize to raise awareness about Asian American mental health struggles. And I'm going to switch sharing my screen over to YouTube.
Luke was
mischievous,
dorky,
full of energy,
extremely silly.
He was curious.
He found a question that he had, he wouldn't let it go.
Questions of like the purpose of life, the meaning of life.
I think he would have turned into this really great professor.
He was really smart. He was a presidential scholar.
Math competition whiz.
Science Olympiad.
Growing up, you always heard your parents say, be like him, achieve what he does. And then all of a sudden, don't be like him. He's made such a huge mistake.
Today, I'd like to talk about people and how we relate to them. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a reason for their behavior, whether we know it or not.
He was like one of my best friends, and I thought we would go through life together.
Like the biggest question, of course, was just why? Why would he do that?
I was completely unaware, and I think most of his friends were unaware that he was struggling with suicidal thoughts or these different questions.
At the funeral, they didn't say it was a suicide. They said he died from a chronic illness.
Because in the beginning, we were told not to tell what happened.
About you.
Math.
Dr. Chen, you are unmuted.
Competition with his.
Sorry, everyone. My Zoom seems to be frozen, so I can't unmute myself, but I did call in through this other way, so I'm glad I did. Can you all see? I'm trying to switch back to the PowerPoint. Looks like I overly taxed
Poor guy.
my computer. 1 second, I'll call back in. Apologies.
No problem.
You can hear me though?
Yes.
No, we can
Okay, so while I'm loading Zoom, I'll just say, this is an incredibly powerful documentary, as you can see. I've seen this film over 50 times, and every time I watch it, the full film, it's 25 minutes, it brings me to tears. It's just very, very sad. And Wendell and Christina Tang, who are the parents in this film that you saw, it's really quite remarkable, actually. You heard in the film that they said initially they were told not to tell what happened because, it was a shame. He completed suicide. And so I'm actually really amazed that and impressed that these parents actually chose to share their story 6 months after the suicide. Currently, the film is unavailable. The parents are actually suing Harvard University for the suicide. And so everything related to the film is embargoed. So unfortunately, we can't show it. But I do know that the wish of the parents in making the film was to raise awareness and to say, we didn't know our son was struggling, and we know everyone could have been doing better. We could have done better, and we hope other parents will do better. So Jan, I'm back in the main room, but I need host sharing privilege to share my slides again. Can you see me over there?
Yes, now you're the co-host.
Let's see. I think can you share with the other one, with the one with the camera?
Now you both.
Perfect, thank you.
We cannot hear you.
Sorry. Let's see. How much did you hear of anything?
Nothing.
No, I got it. No, I got it.
Nothing. Okay, let me go back. I was talking about the previous slide. I was highlighting Julianna Chen, who's an amazing child adult psychiatrist at Mass General and Newton Wellesley. She co-produced this film. And so I was just speaking about the power of breaking these silences. And my point in sharing this film is not to scare anyone. I don't want to scare parents and make you feel like your kids are suicidal. You know, it's really not the point. This was an extreme case. But that being said, I just wanted to raise awareness that mental health is real. We all have it. We all struggle with stress. And even if we don't talk about it, even if we don't really put a lot of thought to it, it's still there. And so this is one example of that. And I hope that after today's talk, everyone will start to think a little bit about, how am I doing? How are my kids doing? And is there more to this than just the accomplishments? And that's sort of, I'm coming to the end of my talk, but that is one big point about this. I think it's great to celebrate achievements, and it's wonderful to be proud of what we do, but also to be aware, you know, we usually only see the good stuff. We only see the CV. And we'll talk about that. When you hear about me, you hear about all the accomplishments, a certain lens, but you don't see all the struggles. And I don't know if any of you all saw this. This is a reporter who went viral. Actually, I think she's a scientist who is being interviewed. But she posted this, I think, on Twitter, where you see this, you know, we're all used to seeing this on Zoom, and then you see what's going on around her. She has her laptop on a chair, on a table. There's like baby toys everywhere. I mean, this is the reality, right? You only see this very curated image. You don't see the rest of it. And so when you think about myself, you know, I'm not going to delve too into detail, but I've struggled all along the way as well. I've had a number of my own family challenges. This is normal in life. I've been rejected all along the way, right? You heard all the things I got into, but you didn't hear all the things I didn't get. And actually, there was a famous Princeton scholar who posted a resume of failures. It was actually really funny because they were like, you only ever see my CV, but they created a CV literally of everything that they didn't get. And, you know, to succeed in life, you actually have, like, it's actually probably more important to figure out how to deal with those lack of successes than to succeed all the time, right? Because if you have to have a thick skin. I can tell you in academia, things get rejected all the time. You don't get grants, you don't get papers published. Yes, you can work harder and try to overcome, but that's only one way of managing that. You also have to find other ways to cope. I graduated medical school with a ton of med school loans. And then all along the way, you know, you see the professional career, but there's so much more to life. Where am I going to live? Who will I be in relationship with? What is my life versus my parents' life? So I'm going to leave you all with a couple of major concepts that I often talk to my patients about. Many times they struggle about what am I going to do? Some of you may know this Japanese concept of Ikigai, which translates to a reason for being. And I really like this simple, it's sort of like a, maybe not so simple, complicated Venn diagram where Ikigai is in the middle. And you can see that the 4 big buckets of things to think about: what are you good at? What can you be paid for? What does the world need? And what do you love doing? And it's actually very common, I find, for students to be able to find something that's like 2 of these. And maybe, you know, again, if you think about my example about the parents, probably parents really want you to do, like, focus on this, what you can be paid for, and probably what the world needs, or maybe what someone is willing to hire you for. But it can be much harder to find something that meets all 4. But I do think that I really like this concept, because I think if you're lucky enough to be able to marry all of these, that can be a very meaningful life. The other thing I want to share with you is the American Psychiatric Association's Wellness Wheel. You know, oftentimes I find that for Asian students, they're really good at like occupational and intellectual, maybe financial. These 3 circles, we are highly developed. But are we as well developed in the social emotional realm, spiritual, physical, and environmental? All of these are important for wellness, according to the American Psychiatric Association. So you can think about this for yourself. Where are the areas that you might want to put a little extra time into? Somehow this went back. And so finally, I'll just leave you with some closing reflections before I tell you a little about our center. So as I think about my own life, you know, yes, there's been a lot of hard work, but there was a lot of luck and chance too. And, you know, we can try really hard, but just be aware some things are out of your control. There are many different types of intelligence and skill, you know, so I ended up being a doctor, but I don't know that that necessarily would have been the case. And I'm a psychiatrist. My parents were actually horrified when they found out I was going to psychiatry. But I think now they see how happy I am, like how well it suits me, and they understand it differently. And so I just put these 2 images of a bamboo and an orchid to give you an example from the plant world. You know, you would never raise these 2 plants in the exact same way. They need a different amount of sunlight. They need a different amount of water, but they're both beautiful. And you just need to understand your plant, just like you need to understand your child. Consider the opportunities as they arise. You don't know necessarily what your path is going to be, and that was very true for me. If any one of you told me 10 years ago that I would be in a medical administrative position and teaching med students, I would have laughed. I definitely wouldn't have thought that. So you have to be open enough to things that come along, and also recognize loss. Because every time you make a decision, you're accepting something, but you're also saying no to something else, and that can be really hard to give up. The importance of finding meaning in what you do, and I do think that the research is correct that relationships and giving to others is a huge source of meaning for most of us. When you think about how do you want to spend your life, those are important, and also the balance I described. I also encourage everyone here to recognize and think about the model minority stereotype that I described. You know, we as a community have been characterized this way, and I think it really does a disservice. There's, you know, we struggle like everyone else, and that can be okay. In fact, if we don't acknowledge those struggles, I think there can be tragedy, as we saw. And then finally, I'm a huge fan of this idea of sustainable success, not just success, but can you sustain it? And I often tell students, you know, don't let getting into whatever university be the best thing you ever do, right? That's not your peak. This is just one step along a longer journey. So I'll end by telling you a few minutes about our center. As I mentioned, we were founded in 2014 by 3 clinicians. We were getting a lot of referrals actually of international students from China in high school. They were struggling with depression, eating disorders, and even suicidal thoughts. And we realized quickly the answer is not to get every single person into psychotherapy. That doesn't make sense. We also don't have the capacity to do so. We really need to start earlier, upstream, and educate and prevent. So are a nonprofit volunteer group, and we are funded by donations and services. And really what we decided, remember I told you I worked at South Cove Community Health Center, and I realized those patients didn't want to come. They didn't want what I was selling. But I said, you know, maybe for an immigrant, their real focus is survival, right? But why did they come to this country? It's for their kids. And so we decided to shift our focus to the children and to say, you know, we know you want your kids to succeed, and we want to help you understand how important emotional wellness is for long-term success. We focus a lot less on psychiatric diagnosis and instead on stress, resilience, coping, and long-term success. So we're a diverse group. We bring a lot of perspectives. We have a lot of teachers, parents, students, everyone in our midst. Primarily, we focus on Asian Americans for now. And this is what we do. You know, today's talk is an example. We do a lot of education prevention. We go directly into the community. One time we were lucky enough, as I said, to get Jeremy Lin down here in the bottom right with us. We also educate the educators. So we do a ton of education to universities, high schools, et cetera. We have an annual membership-based program that they're welcome to join and get access to our experts and our resources. We also create resources that you all may be interested in. So we have fact sheets, often translated into multiple languages. We have videos. Here's a video of psychotherapy. What is psychotherapy? Being done in Mandarin Chinese in case people are kind of confused about what will happen in a therapy session. That's available for free on our website. We also have an annual conference with the Harvard Graduate School of Education on supporting the success and well-being of Asian and Asian American students. Obviously, this is pre-COVID, but the room is usually packed because there's a lot of interest. And this year, because of COVID, we went fully virtual and we held a number of webinars that are all still available for free on our website.
Because it's the same thing I told the other guy.
I think someone's on. Okay. Here's an examples of some of the webinars that we've done to help support our community through COVID. And also to be aware that we are having an awakening right now as a community about racism. I think as a model minority, we have skated under the radar for many decades, but this racism has always been there. It's actually been there since Chinese people first started coming in large numbers to the US in the mid-1800s. So
Dr. Chen, I just want to kindly remind you exceed your time.
Oh, sorry, thank you. I'm almost done. Last couple of slides. We also do research. Here are some examples of the research that we're doing. And finally, some of you know Lily Chen, amazing advocate from United Chinese Americans. We have a group that has a Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholars Program to try to figure out how do we get care to people who need it. So that is my last slide. Thank you so much for your attention. Why don't we hold questions until after the three awardees give their talks, and then we'll have a Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Chen, for your very informative presentation. Now, I'm going to transfer my position to Dr. Xianhe Sun. Dr. Sun is a professor in computer science at Illinois Institute of Technology. He's going to introduce the three panelists who are the former awardees of the Chicago Chinese American Youth Leadership Award. Dr. Sun, it's your turn.
Thank you, everybody. Now we start the second section of this forum. This is a panelist speech session. We invited three panelists from our past winner of this Youth Leadership Award. So they represent different, career paths. One is for, entrepreneur, and one, worked several years back for PhD. One is a fresh PhD and Stanford. So I, without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Jimmy Tsai. So Jimmy Tsai have a very unique, career. So I would like himself to tell you his path to success. Now, Jimmy, now it's your turn.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Sorry, go ahead.
没有 meeting. 又说没有 meeting 了，他可能之前 set 了。
Could you please mute yourself? Whoever is talking, please mute yourself. Jeremy, please.
Host, you can mute others.
Okay, all right, Jeremy, please. Thank you.
First of all, I want to say thank you for having me, and I know Dr. Sun mentioned that I'm successful, but I'm still pretty young, and I think I have a long path ahead of me, and I just want to. First, I just want to say thank you so much to what Professor Justin was sharing. I think it's a very uncomfortable topic for Chinese parents to talk about, and my mom's in the audience here, so I'm sure she doesn't want me to talk about it as well. But I've had a therapist for 5-6 years now. I've had a psychiatrist. I think it's a really important topic. So really appreciate the opportunity to share that. And I've been to a lot of these I think panels, and I avoid them as much as I can, but I didn't expect it to go that route. So I just wanted to say a big thank you. It's a really important topic. And I think it's one that probably most of you don't ever want to talk about. So I really appreciate that. So some quick background on myself. I was kind of, I was going to prepare all my slides like while, Justin was going through his presentation, but I actually found it so engaging that I didn't have the time to, but and I'm also not sure about the breakdown of the people here. I'm supposed to be the guy, on this panel who's had like the business success, and obviously I think either my mom or I wrote my little background here, so it makes me seem much cooler than I am. But ultimately, I'm the guy who is on this panel that dropped out of college. I'm the one who did not become a doctor, an engineer, or a lawyer, whatever it is, and I did all the alternative, non-traditional things. And I'm here to tell you that you should follow my footsteps. Forget about college, drop out, pursue your dreams. I'm just kidding. I know that a lot of the Asian parents here probably, would not be very comfortable with that. So I guess a quick background on myself. I only had a couple of minutes kind of prior to this to prepare. I'm currently the CEO of a company called Italic. I previously founded another company called Fountain.com. I've raised about $80 million or so for both of these companies. And I've invested in another 40, 50 or so companies. A few of them are worth over $1 billion. My coolest job recently, which I'm very proud of, is I'm also a part owner in a Japanese anime studio now that has produced work on shows like Boruto, Digimon, so on and so forth. But I'm actually not here to brag about myself or kind of share too many credentials. I think one thing that I thought could be interesting is, I grew up obviously in the Midwest and in a suburb of Chicago, and I've now that I've lived in California for 4 to 6 years. I've left with COVID, but now I've been out of the Midwest for a while. I think I've realized that the Chinese American and Asian American upbringing is very different, between the two areas. And I think the bigger path for me was, when you're I think the Midwest Chinese American ecosystem is frankly quite conservative. Generally. You grow up with a very singular mission of getting into colleges, exactly like the case that I think Justin shared, where you try to go through all these hoops in life, and each subsequent one, you try to get to Harvard, and then you make it there, and then you try to get to be a doctor or a lawyer, you try to be an engineer, and then after that, it's your parents are probably by then pretty old. When do you start living? And I think in California, I feel like the Asian community is quite different. And I'm not saying either one is better or worse, but I think it's quite different, where you have, Chinese American kids who, frankly, will never become financially successful. And there's a much larger diversity, and there's a lot more Chinese, American kids in general that I think you see a lot more paths in life. And the one that I found was okay, to give you a quick background, I wrote this down. 7 or 8, I don't know how many students are here, but 7 or 8 years ago, I was sitting in your seats feeling really down. I'm sure many of you have similar situations and experiences like me where, those dinner parties where your parents would sit in one room and then compare all the other kids. And then the kids would be very awkward, listening to their parents. So when you grow up, I was the kid who got rejected from all those colleges. I didn't get in Yale, Harvard, Stanford. I got in this very small school called Babson, which to me was oh, I failed. I'm done. My life's over, right? I'm going to go be, a consultant and that's it. But I think I realized up until then, hey, this is my opportunity to reject, tradition and reject the path that was laid out for me by society. And I think even though I'm the one who's speaking here today, I feel like a lot of the kids here can probably relate to that. And I'm only maybe 7 or 8 years past you. I think it was a chance for me to realize hey, I'm going to small school. I realized very quickly, hey, college isn't for me, but I found a way to convince my mom and dad, hey, I can make it even without college. I moved to San Francisco. I got this thing called the Teal Fellowship where this very rich guy will give you money to drop out and stay out of college. So that was my way to convince my parents, hey, it's going to be okay. And the good news about these is it was 20 out of 3,000 applicants. And then I did this thing called YC, which is another 100 out of 50,000. So it was always credentialed, but ultimately I was able to convince my parents to, allow me to stay out of school and fund my own lifestyle. And I think, we can talk about this on the Q&A if anyone's interested. But I think for me, my job here today is to tell all the kids and the parents in the room that, your life is just starting. It doesn't end with getting into a good college. And many of you, I'm sure, won't get into a good college or go to a good college like I did. And there's still a path forward. I think there's endless opportunity, and I think it's up to you to really make those choices for yourself, as opposed to kind of following in someone else's lifestyle that they might have imposed on you from an early age. Not that, again, that's bad. I think there's many merits to that, but I'm here as living proof that you can do something different and survive. And most kids should not do this. Most kids should not, drop out or try to do anything like this. But if you do, I think it's definitely possible. So I will cede my remaining time to anyone else.
Thank you, Jamie. That's why I would say you have a unique success path. So that's why you represent, that will invite you to talk about your experience. Now we go to a second speaker, Casey Lee. She's more tradition. She's in college, back to a graduate school for her PhD. So now we let Casey to talk about her experience and his path to a current, success.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Oh, it says I don't have screen sharing.
Jean, can you give her share screen?
Yes, Kathy, one second. Let me make you co-host. Now you can. Thank you.
Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Kathy. Today, I'm going to be talking about my experience volunteering in the Chinese community and encourage you all to seek out volunteering opportunities of your own if you're currently students. So first, just a little bit about me. I grew up in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. So that's where I lived all my life, and my parents still live there now. I graduated from Harvard in 2016, where I studied applied math, and I'm currently an applied math PhD student at Columbia. I work on developing statistical models for mobile health data, and I'm in my 4th year, so hopefully I'll be graduating soon. And then outside of school stuff, I really love cooking, and I also love dogs. So I say I'm an aspiring future dog owner, but I'm also currently a foster parent with a rescue dog agency in New York, which means that I give basically temporary homes to dogs that are waiting to be adopted. So here's a picture of me with Coco, who is unfortunately not my dog, but was one of my former fosters. So today's presentation, like I said, is basically just going to be about volunteering. So first, a little bit about how I got started. So like many of you, I'm sure as well, I attended Chinese school growing up, basically since I was in kindergarten, I think. And so that was really the community that I was surrounded by when I was a kid. And in addition to that, my dad is actually still the principal of our local Chinese school. So I really had that example of what it looks like to build and give back to a community from a young age. But despite the fact that I, went to Chinese school every week since I was a kid, I was not always the most enthusiastic student. So as you can see here, this is a picture of me from 2000 looking very reluctant at like some kind of dance performance or something at school. I asked my mom to look for pictures of me teaching in Chinese school, and this is what she came up with. So I thought I would include it. And then once I entered high school, I decided to become an ESL teacher for Chinese school. So there's an ESL class there, which is basically directed at elderly and adult students. So a lot of times it would be like the grandparents of the students at Chinese school. And at the time, I think it just seemed like something good to do and something natural to do because my family always went to, Chinese school every weekend anyways. So I thought it was something I would try out. And I ended up teaching ESL every week throughout high school. And I liked it so much that I joined a summer teaching program in China as well. So I went there for 2 summers during high school. And as you can see from this other old photo from 2009, I was very enthusiastic there, and I had a lot of fun teaching little kids. And then when I went to college, I wanted to seek out kind of similar opportunities. And there was actually a very similar program at Harvard called Chinatown ESL, which was also for adult students in the Boston Chinatown area. So I started teaching at that program and then eventually also directed it. So just helping out with organizing and recruiting teachers and things like that. And I think what I want to highlight is that volunteering kind of started as something I was just doing, not really thinking too much about it, but it really grew into something that I genuinely really enjoyed and wanted to seek out independently. And now I just want to talk about some of the benefits of volunteering, which I'm sure you're all aware of. But I think the most important thing, like the most important benefit I can think of is that it's really an opportunity to tangibly uplift and build a community that you believe in. And obviously in this presentation, I focused on the Chinese community because that's my personal experience. And, you know, I think especially nowadays with the rise in anti-Asian sentiment, it is something that I would specifically encourage students to try to do to, you know, build your local Chinese community. But it doesn't have to be your Chinese community or even your local community. It can be any kind of community that you believe in and have a personal connection to. And for me specifically, because I was volunteering in the Chinese community, I think it really did help me feel more connected to my background and have a greater appreciation for even like being able to speak Chinese. And additionally, I think that it can be kind of overwhelming to think about like, how do I fit volunteering into my schedule? Because I know everybody's super busy with school and college apps and all of that. But it really is like a relatively small time investment for something that can have a potentially really big impact. Like those few hours that you spend volunteering can be the highlight of somebody else's week. And volunteering is also a really great opportunity to develop connections with other volunteers and help build skills like interpersonal skills and public speaking, things like that. And then finally, in a broader sense, I think that volunteering is a really great way to kind of better understand what it is you really care about and what you want to invest your time in. And it can lead to a lot of other opportunities as well. So for me, volunteering became a really big part of my high school and college experience. And, you know, even nowadays, I know dog fostering is very different from teaching ESL, but I do think that it's kind of that common thread of wanting to be able to help and give back to others. And finally, some resources if you're not sure how to get started. If you're interested in volunteering specifically with the Chinese community, you can look to your local Chinese school or your local Chinatown community, which is something that I actually really want to do when New York is a little more open, because I think making this presentation made me realize that I really miss teaching, and it's something that was such a big part of my life. And you can also obviously look to your high school or if there's like a college in your area, because at the Harvard program, we actually had some teachers who were high schoolers as well. So that's another option. And then of course, if there's nothing that, you know, really interests you, you can always start your own opportunity. But I think the most important thing is just to find some kind of cause that you really care about and to invest your time and energy into it. And that's all. Here's another picture of me that I found from like 2009 when I was teaching. But thank you for watching this presentation. I hope some of you found it helpful.
Thank you, Casey. Now everybody know why Casey, win the leadership award, youth leadership award. She win that award in 2012. Now we'll turn to the third speaker, Zach C. Zach C is a fresh new student at Stanford. Now we like Zach to share his fresh experience at his academia or college life. Zach, now it's turn to you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. So for me, just a bit of an intro for me. I'm a first year at Stanford and recent graduate of Naperville North. And I don't have too much particular experience, either career-wise or in future academia. So I wanted to sort of take this time to talk a little bit about like reflecting back from the standpoint of like raising your child for college, just things that I thought worked for me and things that I thought really didn't vibe with me during my childhood and youth. And so I wanted to divide this into sort of 3 different segments. First, like leading up to college in general. Second, talking a little bit about my experience in like debate and Discourse Academy. And then finally, my current time here at Stanford and moving forward. And so to start, just a little bit of background. Ever since I was growing up, my parents were your typical like ambitious Asian parents, right? So I was placed into a lot of these activities, some of which were like minimally impactful, right? Like I was told to, play piano, play violin, enrolled in some like 7th grade SAT prep classes. And a lot of these things just like flew over my head, right? Like it's a one and done thing. And then a lot of these activities sort of like, actually I personally found to actually be valuable. Like I was actually kind of grateful, no matter how much I did feel like I suffered back then, that my parents did put me through like these math and reading prep classes because it gave me that strong foundation and a lot of skills that I like still use even now. But I think at some point I found that a lot of these these factors of like pushing your child, for me, a lot of that extrinsic motivation eventually shifted into intrinsic motivation. And so for me, this sort of started in actually like 6th grade. When I joined like this program called PA Plus, which was essentially like you take like a bunch of kids with high test scores and then you like lump them all together. And so I think that's the first like big takeaway that like reflecting back sort of helped me along this path. And that's that the group that I associated myself with really determined my future outcome. It was a lot less about like sort of my personal internal drive at first and more of the fact that my peers around me were really like pushing themselves, and that sort of like internal competitiveness also pushed me to succeed as well. And that's also where I think like reflecting back that I got like my second big takeaway on this path of being successful, I guess. And that's that somewhere along the way in my childhood, or I feel like in general with my peers' childhoods as well, there has to be some sort of shift from external motivation to internal motivation, right? Like you can't keep pushing your kid to keep studying and studying throughout like high school to get into college, and then keep pushing them to study in college to get a specific major, to get a specific career, et cetera, et cetera. Right? At some point, that motivation has to shift to an internal mindset. And for me, I think sort of starting middle school, being associated with this peer group, that's where I found that that sort of started with me. And so that's where I want to move into sort of like the second part. And that's for me grappling between like choosing STEM and choosing the humanities. And so one of the cons of this group that I was associated with is that everybody had very similar values, and a lot of the group was also very Asian. And so they had this very like linearly defined path of what exactly success is. So I very clearly remember in middle school, all of my peers around me were really hyper-focused on, math counts and science Olympiad. And these were both activities that I absolutely sucked at, right? So I tried out for both of those teams 3 years in a row. And then I remember watching all my peers like celebrating after they made the science Olympiad team or made the math counts team. And I was sort of just like moping, like, I'm not really good at anything, right? But so in high school then, when we had more opportunities and varieties in terms of what we could try, I decided to try something new. And that was the debate team. And debate was absolutely brutal, right? But I sort of like fell in love with it. You would like wake up at 5 a.m. on a Saturday and compete for 9 hours. But like within that span of time, what I felt really valuable for me was the fact that I loved presenting, I loved arguing, and I loved being able to pull up a crisp argument every once in a while. And so in high school, I sort of like started debating and continued debating. And so I had this, eventually I hit this point where in Illinois, like you can only like debate so much because you're competing against the same people over and over again. And I got to this point in which, I got a little bit cocky. And then I was like, let me try something bigger. And that's where I tried to go to this program called the National Circuit, which is where you sort of like fly around and compete at different universities. And this is actually credit to my dad because he was the one that sort of like pushed me to try something this crazy. Even though for me, I feel like spending $1,000 to fly somewhere to compete was absolutely insane. And so the preparation leading up to my first tournament was in Atlanta, Georgia. And the preparation leading up to that was absolutely brutal. It was like 4 hours a day of just like looking at like PDFs of like economics files and just like trying to translate those into notes. And then the day of the actual competition was 12 hours of straight competition. And I remember after the preliminary round, I walk up to the board and I know that having spent $2,000 with my dad to fly to this other state, I was like, if I don't make the next round, you know, that's a lot of wasted potential. And it turns out I don't make the next round. So I spent all this money, all this time, flew to a tournament in another state and came back with nothing, right? But that's also sort of where I came to my sort of like third big like motivator and something that I found for me to personally be really beneficial in terms of like success. And that's like afterwards, I remember my dad and I went to watch the round of people who did make the next round. So the people who did make it past the preliminary round. And I remember watching the people give speeches. And I don't know whether this was either an inflated ego or some sense of naivete. But I remember looking at the people giving their speeches and debating and thinking like, I could do that, right? Like I was looking at those people and I remember like, that's not that different from something that I could sort of emulate. And so like the third big takeaway that I came away with was that no matter like whether or not I actually could have done that, I later came to find that their skills were way beyond mine. But having the sense of false confidence or just like an inflated sense of self-efficacy is something that I found to really push me through debate as well as just my academic career in general. And so I continued to speak more and more and go to more and more tournaments. And then eventually that's where I sort of started like, you know, growing a network in these tournaments, interacting with different students. People started to recognize me more, and eventually the judges started to recognize me as well. I got better and eventually started winning tournaments. But that's also where at that point I started shifting into more of a broader look. I remember going to one tournament at Kentucky, and this is where I sort of get into community service and impacting the Asian American community. I remember going to this one tournament in Kentucky and realizing I was not only was I the only Asian kid in the room out of maybe like 60 competitors, but I was the only non-white kid in the room of people competing in this congressional debate event. And so that's where, sort of reflecting back, I sort of realized that a lot of these skills in the Chinese American community, skills of like politics, debate, or speech, are typically seen as like less valuable, right? Because studying politics, I mean, when you think about it practically, like it seems like studying politics won't give you like the same salary as maybe like learning how to code or grinding on LeetCode or something. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of these core skills of being able to stand up and advocate for yourself, stand up and speaking for your values. Those are skills that I really wanted to emphasize for myself, as well as to spread to the Chinese American community. And so that's where I helped found Discourse Academy. And Discourse Academy was originally just a summer camp in which we tried to teach a few students like skills of like public speaking or like political efficacy. And after our initial program, it sort of grew and grew. And then we continued to host programs throughout the Chicagoland area. And so that's where I sort of get to part 3, and that's just a bit bit of a segment on like my current time at Stanford and things that I'm planning doing forward. So for the college application process, most things are already predetermined before you sort of go in. And so for me, it was just a combination of my experience in debate, plus the academics that I was sort of, you know, competing with my friends to get top grades, and then a lot of luck that I got in. But the thing that I've actually really noticed now being here is that the importance of, or the traits that I've noticed across people is not that like everybody in Stanford is really good at like CS or really wants like, you know, drop out and found a startup or something or has that same mentality. But actually the thing that makes the people here so unique is that everybody has something about their personality that actually makes them unique, right? So you'll have somebody that, for example, like me did like debate nationally, and then you'll have somebody else who has already worked as like a software engineer at Boeing. And then you'll have somebody else who, you know, is a math Olympiad winner, right? And so it turns out that a lot of the people here at college, I feel like what Stanford really valued in their application was not this like linearly defined path towards success, but rather what individual traits, what individual interests can you show to show that you'll bring something unique to the community and you'll sort of contribute. And so I guess that just brings me to my current plans, in which going forward, I don't particularly have defined plans yet, being a first year in college, but I of course want to practice, talking with people with different matrices of success and learning more about the other people here at Stanford. And then also practice staying in the moment and being mindful. So yeah, that's my portion of the talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you for the good speech to share your personal experience and feelings. And now, Dr. Wang, now I'm turning to you. This section is finished.
Okay, then we can go to our next session. That is our discussion panel. Dr. Chen, you're the boss for the next session.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. All right, so the future is bright. My gosh, these three are so inspirational. I figure I had some questions for them, but I actually would love it if this was a little more interactive. So I see we have almost 200 people in the audience. Maybe if folks want to type any questions into the chat, that might help us and we can hear what you think. Let's see, I see one thought. I would like to know how to encourage Chinese youth to participate in civic engagement and social responsibility activities in the recent anti-Asian hate crime movement. I think that's a great question. Maybe I'll turn it over to the three panelists. First of all, thank you all. I think you all spoke so vulnerably and you modeled exactly what I was talking about in my speech. So, Jeremy, thank you for sharing about your therapy experiences and your non-traditional path to success. Kathy, thank you for talking about giving back to the community. I think that was so powerful and such an important topic. And actually, maybe you might take a first stab at this because it is in many ways related, this idea that you don't just live for yourself, but you have to figure out how you use your benefits for others. And Zach, of course, thank you. We met last night as well. It's so inspiring to hear you, even at an early stage of your career, aware of how much you don't know and also how much these things that you didn't necessarily plan for can be helpful in your future career. So would any of you, maybe starting with Kathy, like to discuss increasing civic engagement among Chinese youth, especially in response to racism?
Yeah, sure. So I know that I kind of mentioned this very briefly in my presentation at the end about kind of talking about the benefits of volunteering. I think in terms of encouraging people to get involved, I'd like to highlight the point about kind of like relatively little time investment or kind of how small actions can have a big impact. So I think seeking out opportunities that are relatively small. Like I know, for example, in New York, there are things you can volunteer for where they're like handing out free pepper spray or something like that to people in Chinatown. And it's something that is relatively small, but once I think you get involved and you see the impact that you're able to make, it's kind of like a rolling ball. Like once you get started, it's easy to kind of keep continuing to do that and feel inspired by that.
Jeremy or Zach?
Yeah, this is a really hard one because I think like it's partially hard because I think it's impossible to generalize, but I think like a lot of us are more silent than not, especially when it comes down to anything political, right, and social and in general. And I think like the typical, let's say the past couple of decades, like the typical reaction is like brush it under the rug, don't talk about it, like move on with your life, right? And I think this is an interesting time in being an Asian American because it's the first time when I've actually seen it hit mainstream. Typically when these things happen, you see it in a very small environment or like it's isolated to you. And obviously, I'm sure all of us have experienced racism in some form or shape growing up or moving to the States. But I do think it's in my opinion, at least, like the best way to solve it is by having more presence or more participation from Asian Americans and Chinese Americans in places where young kids can really look up for inspiration. When I was growing up, there were very few role models in sports, for example, which I know Justin mentioned. or business, you had a couple guys. Now it's changed a lot, but I think ultimately the more, and same goes for Hollywood, right? Like very few Chinese or Asian men especially being represented in the big screen. So I think if there were opportunities for these kids to kind of be included or step up to participate in areas where they historically would not have been part of the conversation, I think that can change generationally. And I do think, like, even for me, going back to where I grew up, like the high school and the entire community has changed a lot. I know many of the kids here, I'm sure, like I remember like being very embarrassed about bringing my Chinese food, into a school lunch, and like people, it's a very common narrative and trope, but like it's a common story where like everyone's like, oh, that's a very like it's weird smelling, weird looking food. But then nowadays it's like, hey, this is actually pretty in vogue. Like people like Japanese food, people like Chinese food. So I don't know. I think the best way to do it is just continually exposing people to Asian culture in a respectful way. We have as a community, I think, have a lot of areas where we can improve as well. I think the Asian community is also very racist internally as well as externally. So it's a really complicated topic that I don't think any of us are probably individually able to fully respond to. But that's my quick 2 cents.
Great comment. Zach, do you want to add anything, or are you good? We can move on to another question too.
Yeah, I guess I'd just say, tagging along just one short thing. I think one of the things I want to focus about, like Jeremy said, it's often very easy to brush a lot of these comments like under the rug. But at least my mindset for thinking about this is you're not just representing yourself when you're standing up, but you're also defending your community as a part of your Chinese American and Asian American community when you do speak up against these comments. And so I would just say that's one motivating factor that I try to use.
I'm going to check in quickly with Jan. How much time do we want to spend? I know we were going to end around now, 4:15, but can we go on for another 10 minutes or so? It's such a good conversation.
Yeah, definitely, please.
Okay, I just want to add to this. I totally agree with what those three just said, and I really, want to highlight: get educated and speak up. We are the model minority. We're supposed to be very submissive and obedient. We do our jobs. We keep our heads down. There is a certain degree to which people, you do have to work hard, like I said. But I also think we need to, if we don't ask for things, we won't get them either. And I know that's not culturally, very taught. But we live in a different society here in America. And I think about myself, I was one who liked to be not in the spotlight and sort of be more doing my work kind of behind the scenes. And this opportunity to take my current job in the medical administration came up, and it was really hard for me because I'm not someone who likes to actually speak in public. You may be surprised, but I don't like to be out there. And that was partly, I think, based on my own experiences growing up in this country as a minority, kind of just trying to fit in and skate under the radar. And so I actually pushed myself. I said, I'm going to do it. And now in my leadership position, I'm the only Asian person in the room. Like it's always, I look around and I'm the only minority, I should say. But I'm so glad because I think, if we don't do it, then who's going to? So let's speak up. And also, as Jeremy said, it's not just when we're under attack. Right now, we're being attacked by racists, but other times other people are being attacked. Think about 9/11, when a lot of sort of Indian, brown minorities are being attacked. And do we speak up? I think we all need to always speak up against injustice, even if it's not affecting us. So I want to ask this next question from Cindy Jiang, because I think I was also asking you all this question. What do you three successful award winners recommend for Chinese parents? What would you like them to know? And I think, Zach, you had said you might answer this one. Can we start with you?
Yeah, so I think, I'll take this from one of the lens of just like generally like raising your child, but also impacting the community. I feel like a lot of the sort of mindset of the Asian American community, or the Chinese American community, as I've thought of it, has been to follow this very narrow idea, and then like you said, to sort of like keep your head down. But I think one of the interesting things is that a lot of what's celebrated in the United States, or this different mentality, is that of like being individualist, and sort of a lot of the things of what's celebrated is determined by what you're doing differently. And so just making sure that if your child does have, whether it's like expressing an interest in a different subject, or whether it's, if they're not as confident of some like personality trait or some like cultural trait, making sure that they're proud of that. And understanding that that sort of like represents their heritage and is something that should be celebrated. I think that's something that would be really important to teach your child moving forward.
Thank you. Anyone else, Kathy or Jeremy?
Yeah, Justin, I feel like you might like this one, but I feel like a lot of I imagine there's a lot of first generation Chinese or Asian parents in the room where, your kids now are the first generation to grow up in a different country, or, in the States in our case. And, I and many of us, I think, grew up with American friends and like understanding, like being very Westernized. And of course there's, I could talk about that experience as a whole, but I feel like one thing that was very awkward for a while is there's this very like unspoken, like, for example, a lot of Chinese parents will never tell their kids like, I love you, right? And that's like a very uncomfortable thing. But over time, especially like once you get out of college and you I think you see your parents less as these imposing figures in your life of like, you have to do this, you have to do that. And more of like, hey, you're a peer, you're a friend, like we can talk about things beyond like getting into college or my grades or, what have you. I think that's something that I wish I could have done earlier. I know my parents are here. I'm going back to see them, I think in a week or two, and we have like a birthday, but I wish we could have done that sooner. I feel like to have a friend as a parent is very rewarding and gratifying. And it's kind of an uncomfortable transition that I feel like a lot of the kids make over time, especially as these kids are now going into college and leaving home for the first time. So I think to the parents, like, hey, embrace it. Your kids are going to be gone soon, and they're in the States, so they're not going to visit like as much as in China. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Kathy.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to echo what Jeremy just said about, well, first of all, I think that's very true about at first your parents are your parents when you're a little kid. And then as you get older and older, you're like, oh, they're kind of like my friend. I can just talk to them. And I think that what you said about like, oh, how, it can be stereotypically hard for Asian parents to express kind of like affection and things like that. I think that just generally a recommendation for Chinese parents is to recognize the importance of those words of affirmation, like saying things like, I'm proud of you, or I support you, no matter what, I think helps establish that trust earlier on, so then that as your kids get older, you can eventually have that more, I guess, personal, like peer-to-peer relationship.
That's so great. And actually, that's one of the things our center is very interested in is communication in families, because it's so hard. I mean, think about the language and cultural barriers. We've just filmed a Chinese immigrant father having a heart-to-heart conversation with his American-born son, who's now very successful, but they have a conversation about how hard it was for them to talk to each other growing up. And what we learn, of course, is that the father had the same relationship with his father. So, he came by it honestly, like he didn't have a relationship with his father in China where they could talk. So I think this is an amazing moment in our community, again, where we can start to break down some of these barriers. And it's not to say that parents will necessarily always agree or condone everything their kids do, but at least to listen. I think that's so, so, so important. The last thing I'll say is advice for parents. I heard this from Paul Lee, who's a parent advocate in Maryland. Love your child, right? And I totally empathize with Jeremy's story about sitting in the kitchen, like with the parents all comparing their kids next door. You just have this feeling like it's never good enough. And, if you love that child's accomplishments so much, why don't you have that child? It's kind of an unfair race. And I think my mom would say to me, well, I do it because I love you and I want you to be better. But I think, there's a limit to that. And sometimes what the child hears is, you're not good enough. So just to be aware of how that might come across. So maybe one or two more. There was one question here from Kevin Guo about how do you take first steps to becoming more proactive in expressing yourself in a unique way? So we were all joking about the stereotyped ways of achieving success, but how do you know what might be, what you should pursue that might not be so stereotypical? And they wanted to mention the model minority stereotype. So how do we be more proactive in expressing ourselves in a unique way? What I'm thinking about Jeremy and Zach both, you both took risks and did something that your parents didn't suggest for you. How did you know to do that?
Well, I think maybe it firstly starts with having a realization of like, hey, what society and what like your friend groups and your parents and their friends have imposed as expectations on you over basically the course of your entire childhood and going into into adulthood. I think there's a tendency to essentially like have your life plan written out for you. And I think Zach was saying this during his little, his part, but I feel like, there's a point to which I think you have to, as an individual, have to decide like, hey, this is actually what I'm personally interested in for my own sake, more so than like the sake of getting into college or getting that job or whatever it is. And I think in that regard, like I wish I stood up for myself more in the form of like, hey, this is what I'm personally interested in. And I'm very introverted and shy. Like my mom has a thing where I was growing up and like, oh, you should be a magnet and like be extroverted and like that way you're you can make friends. And I had to force myself to adopt that. But I think like over time, there's just like once you figure out what you're personally excited about and passionate about, it becomes much easier to become more outgoing or pursue that. So I think, I don't know, it's a very simple answer, but that's probably how I'd frame it for myself.
Zach?
Yeah, I'd also just add on to that point. Once you do have that idea of what you're personally excited about, I think oftentimes it's also a little bit terrifying to step into a path that maybe isn't as predefined or planned out. And I think at that point it's just you have to have this sort of a sort of confidence, whether it's like a gut feeling or a trust in some idea of like fate or whatever, that eventually like the lines will connect. And you can't really see that path going forward. So for me, that was I couldn't see that like choosing to like participate in the humanities would like sort of lead me here. But I think you have to have that sense of confidence that as long as you're pursuing something that you believe to be personally beneficial, that eventually the path will open up for you going forward.
Thank you. And I think we'll end on one last question. There was a question about why Indians take more leadership positions, but maybe more broadly, we can take a step back and think about, you all have heard of the bamboo ceiling. It's an analogy to the glass ceiling that women face in the workplace. Why are we so successful? We have such high rates of education and we become engineers and doctors, but there's so few of us in the C-suite, the corner suite, or executive level suite, meaning the CEOs, the executive boards. Do you have thoughts about that and what we can do as a community to change that? Maybe I'll start with Jeremy as a CEO yourself.
Yeah, well, I think it starts with like, I feel like humans, not just people, like everyone has role models in life. And I think like when you're a kid growing up, like our role models were always painted to be, and again, there's nothing wrong with this path, but like doctors, lawyers, etc. And I think in my case, at least, my mom was an entrepreneur and so it's a little bit biased here, but I think there weren't that many people to look up to who like took a leadership path. And at the time, this has changed a lot over the past kind of couple of decades, especially in Silicon Valley, where, a lot of these younger, Asian founders who've eventually gone on to become quite successful. But I think, for me, at least, I would say, it was having like role models to look up to when you were growing up, to really inspire you to kind of like follow down someone else's path. And then I think on the flip side, like a lot of times the concept of the bamboo ceiling, I think is very true, as is the glass ceiling, where I think these Chinese American kids and Asian American kids will be so compliant in chasing down this like very prescriptive path that like, hey, you're eventually going to be stuck at like a VP. Or I'm just talking about business, right? Like VP, SVP, maybe a C-level, but very rarely like a CEO job, because you're not the one who's going to stand up and like make bold decisions. And you didn't grow up that way where kind of that was your second nature to just like ask why or be loud. And I think it's not that that's a bad thing. It has to be catered to the individual, and most people should never be a CEO for a good reason. But I think it's ultimately just like having a culture where that's accepted, and also one where that's looked up to. In China, for example, the most when they do surveys with children, it's like, what's the most respected jobs? It's like, I want to be a teacher, I want to be like a doctor, and so on and so forth. But in the States, it's like, I want to be a CEO, I want to be a an influencer or YouTuber or whatever it is. So I don't know. I feel like we could have more role models here, especially in the Midwest. I feel like there's very few of us, but yeah, I think that's my quick 2 cents.
Kathy, could I impose on you, both as an Asian woman, but also woman, right? There's traditionally underrepresentation. What advice do you have?
Yeah, so I guess I will first speak to, I think, so I actually worked for a year in between school. So I think I have experience in this both in a professional setting and an academic setting where you feel like you are kind of restricted and you're afraid to speak up about things. So I think I've definitely experienced this. And I think my advice would be, I know it's very difficult, but you have to have the courage to kind of make a first step. Like I feel like in the workplace, there were times when I had to have those kind of difficult conversations with people, whether they were people who were like my manager or my mentor or something like that. And it's really hard to take that first step. But kind of speaking to wanting to set an example for others, sometimes you do have to be your own advocate, and that can be something that's really difficult. But I think first, I guess, trying to seek out somebody who you can confide in and trust in whatever space you're in, whether that's like at school or at work or whatever. And if you can't find that, I think that sometimes you have to take that first step yourself. And oftentimes I think when you do have a conversation with anybody about it, you will see that there are other people feeling the same way as you. And that can be kind of just like the important first step to take.
Thank you, Kathy. Zach, anything quickly to add?
Yeah, of course. I think for me, it would just be my experience with that would be similar in debate, in which you see a lot more South Asians participating than East Asians. And I guess the mentality is just, you have to be scrappy. You have to, take those first few steps to get comfortable speaking out for yourself. And eventually you get into the state in which you're more comfortable advocating for yourself in general.
Great. So I will say, I actually think that Asians and Chinese people make excellent leaders. We are very collaborative. We tend to really think about others. And I think our leadership style tends to be leading from behind, which is actually a really strong skill. You don't command things, you seek consensus. And that's actually a wonderful way to lead. But we also have to sometimes raise our hand and say yes and take that risk. And then you could be rewarded. So I'm going to close my part here. Thank you to the 3 awardees for amazing wisdom. I think you've taught us all a lot. I'll turn it back to Jan.
Okay, very, very nice discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Chen. Thank Jeremy. Thank Kathy. Thank Zach. I think this is a very wonderful discussion. So I hope that in the very near future, we'll have chances to discuss with you about more topics. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, our president got a few words to say.
Well, I just want to thank everybody, Dr. Chen and all the panelists for today's very meaningful discussion. As an event planner, this is the first time we didn't plan for the content. We decided to let it go. Of course, we're a little bit nervous about what's going on, but like Dr. Chen was saying, we are looking beyond the shining surface and looking to the motivation and the issues. Sometimes it could be uncomfortable, but that's something we need to face, and very important discussion. Thank you so much. Before we close, I want to just the logistic things. First of all, we will distribute today's presentation, Dr. Chan's presentation, to the community, and also just want to bring back to this leadership award that we kicked off last week and officially today. So the deadline for application is April 30th. So, and please do apply the send applications through CAGC website, which is cagc.org. And we will have more information. We keep posting information, update information on our website. So with that, we can conclude today's discussion. Thank you very much. Today's very meaningful and important discussion. We will talk to you more about that. Thank you so much. Goodbye for now. Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jeremy and Dr. Chen and Zach.